For anyone listening, my name is Sarah Fleiss. I'm an opera singer studying at the Curtis Institute of Music. I'm here with Alfred Darlington, aka Daedelus, one of my favorite musicians, and they so humbly accepted to speak with me over Zoom for my final project. I've been studying the history of electronic music, and I hope to find a connection between the main themes we've touched upon in my course, taught by the brilliant Thomas Pattison, to my guest's own process and experience as an electronic composer, performer, and educator. So now that we have that outline, I just had to say all those things.
No, of
Um,
course.
how are you today?
I'm hanging in there. You will hear distinctly in the background the hopefully joyous, somewhat screams of my child. They turned 13 months in some days.
Okay.
Thank you. And it's an adventure, and they may interrupt slightly onto our interview space as this is a weekend, and I am so very grateful to have more concentrated time. I do spend a bit of time commuting and being in Boston from my home base here in Providence
Mm,
currently, and that alone makes it so that I don't quite get as much of that face to face on a daily, but then on weekends and a lot of even weekdays, there's time. So I wouldn't have been able to tell you that as a musician, the idea of an expanding family, a release that wasn't a record, so to speak,
wow,
was very
yeah.
foreign to my mind
Hmm.
until really recently, and it's a joy to have right now.
Wow. Well, congratulations. That must be so wonderful.
Such an amazing, but such a strange journey for sure.
Right. So, to start off the interview, I wanted to read to you a Francis Bacon quote, actually, that has stuck with me throughout my course. It's a quote from his 1626 like utopian science fiction work, New Atlantis. Um, it's kind of long, so I'll drop you the quote
Great.
in the chat. Um, let's see if this works. I don't know if this is going to work, so maybe I'll just read it to you and then I'll get to your initial thoughts.
Sure. Yeah.
So, okay. We also have sound houses where we practice and demonstrate all sounds and their generation. We have harmonies which you have not, of quarter sounds and lesser slides of sounds. Diverse instruments of music, likewise to you unknown, some sweeter than any you have, together with bells and rings that are dainty and sweet. We represent small sounds as great and deep. Likewise, great sounds, extenuate and sharp, we make diverse tremblings and warblings of sounds, which in their original are entire. We represent and imitate all articulate sounds and letters, and the voices and notes of beasts and birds. We have certain helps which set to the ear do further the hearing greatly. We have also diverse, strange, and artificial echoes, reflecting the voice many times, and as it were, tossing it, and some that give back the voice louder than it came, some shriller, some deeper, yeah, some rendering the voice differing in the letters or articulate sound from that they receive. We have also means to convey sounds in trunks and pipes, in strange lines and distances. So that was kind of a
Prescient.
lot,
Oh
but
my gosh. Yeah. So very prescient. So very ahead of the game. We're only just catching up.
yeah.
Plenty of shrill voices, but we're only catching up to half of that. So it's amazing.
Right, right. So we read this quote right at the start of our semester, and the author who referred to it believed it was one of the first documented instances of, and I quote, the human urge to originate, record, and manipulate sound. Um, what do you feel about this innate human desire?
Yeah. I mean, although this may be early for the written word, obviously, because the printing press and otherwise might have conveyed this to us, I think if you if you want to get more broad in terms of our interaction with audio phenomena and the word, and you don't have to look much further than most or all religious texts.
Mm,
Um, there's kind of a conveyance of usually celestial voices or kind of demi-human or godlike or god period, as conveyed by sound and almost never seen in most historic texts. Part of that has to do with like the kind of awe-inspiring power of it where you can't look upon. That's one of the conceits or excuses, or that we can't even conceive of the godhead type figure, but sound received by us. And so the religiosity of sound and its phenomena and the way we would transcribe that and transmit it, although maybe not recorded. And indeed, that idea of like where we kind of landed in terms of recorded audio is really, again, prescient on Francis Bacon's part. But you can still see that the kind of the willfulness of having of the container of knowledge not just be the words or letters themselves, but to be actually the feelings and emotions that music does so elegantly and maybe is unmatched with any other medium or art form. And so it kind of, you know, it doesn't have to be recorded for it to be handed down very gracefully from, teacher to student or from parent to child, for millennia, just like a lot of religion was conveyed. And then also on top of that, although you, it's like the kind of urge to kind of also find new harmonies. I think it's interesting too that I don't want to prescribe yay or no, but like you have this expansion of the world that was happening around Francis Bacon's time, beyond the spice trade, beyond that kind of thing, where strange and beautiful melodies were probably being brought along with warring or trading peoples, and the kind of way that a lot of Europe was colonizing the world in part and kind of continuing would have been an onrush of a lot of neat and beautiful and disturbing culture. And a lot of that was conveyed by a song, right? As people were moving about, the way that it didn't match our exact kind of harmony, that didn't match the Gregorian chant and these other kind of things that had so many rules, and here are these transgressors that are elsewhere. And so kind of assisting or aiding in our idea of the other was so much a part of sound, and the way that it would kind of, I know these are terrible terms and we've moved so much far beyond them, but this idea of the savage somewhere else was usually because they just didn't use even temperament, or like what would become even temperament or 12 tone scales. It's just so strange in hindsight, but the
Wow.
world is, yeah. And we're only catching up to microtonal music in many ways. Like the actual ability to like transgress the keyboard currently is much on our minds, and
Right.
is a relatively new invention compared to where
Mhm.
it sat in history. So
Yeah, right. And for me, as a classical musician, I find myself sometimes struggling with that because we learn the form so deeply, and the form is beautiful and great, and the history of the form is so beautiful, but that's not all that there is, and that's not the full entirety or possibility of sound. So sometimes I find myself struggling with that, and that's why I think electronic music is so important, because you can work between those lines and hear those sounds that you don't normally get to hear, and give other people the opportunity to do that. Um,
well, going back to Francis Bacon too, one of the important things that he's talking about inventing is the being able to accurately convey the human voice across great distances, to record it and like process it, move it. And I will say that the one of the things that's really interesting in over history, electronic music has put it at its foundational moments in terms of like the first synthesizers were there to basically approximate voice.
mm,
There's a few other versions of that, of course, too, with just like the theremin and other technologies. But
right.
some of the early stuff going on is these kind of synthesizers of voice that are there to in part try to capture the entirety of the instrument. And of course, as you know probably too well, melisma and all these other facets are moving constantly through pitch degrees
Mm,
that give us feeling. And generally, as a classically minded person, you probably just are moving between fixed kind of poles, but that progression through is so at the base of like why electronic music sometimes made that choice of having some distance between, or some movement or some possibility of being in between, because the human voice, of course, in its richness does that constantly. Like people aren't unpitched, they're all over the place.
right.
And it's kind of the joy and the difficulty of the matter. So
Wow. Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm just taking all of this in. Um, and so, to touch on the kind of the history of electronic music, because you mentioned the first sort of synthesizers, Um, do you ever think about kind of the earlier schools of electronic music, like musique concrète or the electronische music school? And are they ever an influence on your work? Because we spent a lot of time dissecting them because they really are the seminal kind of forms. So,
Well, it's the enshrined stuff. I would argue that maybe the seminalness of it, it it dates back to what we find important, and tends to be what we find important are, I mean, not to take to task any kind of any study of sound, and obviously any perspective, there's limited time, so there's only so many people we can get into these kind of things, but it tends to be these white male enshrined Europeans that made something important, like were reactions to world wars, that
mm-hmm.
were also Eurocentric activities. And there's obviously great exceptions, many great exceptions, but just the fact that, that Cage or Xenakis will come up quicker than a Delia Derbyshire, or or many other, Laurie Spiegel. There's so many worthwhile composers that were doing important work. But anyways, and also just the kind of what is now termed a EDM or a modern electronic music has different roots that were pretty ignorant towards music concrete and otherwise. And even though we all owe a great deal of debt to that history, and in ways that I find important. So what I will say, to kind of to backtrack then all my words I just put down, is that my parents had a great collection of Folkways records, of Nonsuch, these kind of labels that would release progressive electronic music, what would be termed as progressive electronic music, and now again is kind of has a different facing. But so like I had a lot of, even my parents even realized a Cage piece with John Cage, so this weird amount of like proximity to some of those music concrete and kind of like electroacoustic kind of techniques and these things. And although I don't think I sourced my ears there, even though I was very adrift in these kind of whole sound worlds that they would compose, the chaos of it didn't appeal to me necessarily. The kind of cacophony did. And then finally the playfulness that would occur when you listen to Pierre Henry, like these kind of music concrete, or like, like they there's a lot of their personality that gets like pushed against weird sourced material that ends up being kind of non sequitur or fun. I would also listen to like a lot of, my parents were fans of this important radio personality named Dr. Demento, who would play novelty music. And one of the interesting things about electronic music is there's a serious camp of serious composers doing serious work. And then there's these weirdos that were making novelty sounds that were just trying to approximate what space would sound like, or speeding up and slowing down records, and pushing them together in funny ways that would just be there for laughs in this very gimmicky way. And they're not so distant from each other, because the serious techniques are the same things that these gimmick producers, these novelty makers are doing, and yet just a very different kind of outcomes and ends. And I liked that richness. I liked that interplay, that that's possible. There's not many genres that laugh at themselves. There's not many genres that can be like dead serious and also kind of a joke at the same time. You can think of a handful, but music tends to be one way or the other. And electronic music has kind of had a dual history, like that song Popcorn. I don't know if you've ever heard that, from the 60s, I want to say.
I don't think I've heard that one. No.
It's one of those things where if you heard it, you'd be like, that thing, like that weird melodic refrain that kind of gets repackaged every so often by like a crazy frog, or like it just seems like it comes back every once in a while in these weird waves of novelty. And it's one of these early versions of a lot of like a synthesizer led song, a drum machine led song, all these different like firsts for the pop music industry. And yet here it is, just sitting there kind of as a joke, versus, yeah, I don't know, Reich or whatnot.
Right.
But that being said, I was awash in some of that stuff, and I ended up really taking after some like John Oswald, or Osgood Oswald, who did a lot of the plunderphonic kind of work. That was, I sourced a lot of inspiration, even though I didn't like the soundscape that John got to necessarily. But I love the act of tearing asunder and recombining, and finding from that something that transgresses like both original sound sources, or all the original sound sources.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of inspiration from the act, but not the actors, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I actually, so I've seen your TED talk,
Okay.
which was I think, wonderment the perceptions of performance.
Yeah, like that. Yeah.
um, and yeah, you mentioned kind of plunderphonic music, and kind of the idea of sampling and I guess novelty too.
Mm.
This is kind of a broad question, but what is novelty to you? Because in my course as well, we've talked about the idea of novelty and how electronic music, some genres explore novelty and novelty sound, and maybe explore the novelty that we have in us innate. So what does that mean to you, and what does it convey?
Yeah, I mean, the simplest form, I feel like novelty isn't meant to last. It's that kind of punchline that once it's been delivered, you're not going to laugh again because the joke's been given, right? Like, so in some
Uh,
ways, and not to always put it into a joking perspective, because novelty doesn't have to be that way. The one hit wonder, the kind of the way pop operates often, you hear the song and it may commit you to dance, it may get some sort of emotion kicking, but it doesn't necessarily stay longer than the season it's given.
mm,
And so I kind of feel like novelty operates like that. Like novelty is the key for the lock, but you know you're going to be changing your apartment really soon. And you're not going to stick around there necessarily, not live in that same place. But then at the same time, though, there's plenty of novelty that tends to be seminal, plenty of novelty that is all time, and some of that has to do with the way we're wired. We tend to like unique, novel, distinct, and I oftentimes think about the fact that if music was really much more like the science it describes itself as, if music theory was music science, this kind of constant reassessing the old masters to find the new iteration of what music wants to be, we would be we'd be constantly refining towards a perfect song. Like, and there's these moments in time that tend to, historically speaking, come together kind of perfectly to make a Beatles or a Michael Jackson or these other forces of beyond pop music into social change and become really important, like maybe more so than their music, the kind of totality of their work. And in that definition, they're kind of the ultimate novelty. They're the summation of a lot of forces that bring up. But then at the same time, like, why did we not just stop listening to any other music and just settle on the Beatles or settle on Jimi Hendrix or Janis Joplin, or these people, these important figures from the past? Like, why didn't it just music stop? And of course, that isn't how it operates. That isn't how it works. Our brain doesn't function like that. We want something new and abnormal, and the new generation of listeners wants to upend the previous norms of the. And then we also want to discover what happened in the past, but make it the present, and all these things. But it does kind of work at like, well, does novelty always stay novelty? Does it sometimes like kind of shatter and become something that stays in our psyche long after? And to add to this, to the depressing factoid that I heard not too long ago, that like people stop discovering music almost entirely after they're 32, I believe the magic number was, or maybe it was 28. It was some very early year for people to stop trying to listen to anything new. Like any other music that comes along by radio or by YouTube or whatever else just bounces off of them. They won't buy it. They won't like go any further because partially it's in the culture, right? Like they're not like going out to a CD store for their normal form of entertainment. It's just they're getting stuff's arriving to them and they're not needing to integrate it somehow in their kind of pastiche or whatever. They're done. They're out. So what does novelty mean to somebody who's novelty proof, who isn't going to have any new music? it's uh
wow.
it's a strange one, but
Yeah.
that's kind of, I mean, I would be curious on the more like more official version of novelty that maybe came from the course,
Hmm.
but yeah, that's where I've
Yeah.
arrived thus far.
I can't really give you that answer. I don't know exactly what we talked about, but I know we referenced it in the context of our discussions. And yeah, I think electronic music is so interesting because you can really look at it and dissect it from a lot of different perspectives. So, from a more pure psychological perspective, that idea of going to a dance floor and then hearing music and samples and things and sounds you've never heard and experiencing that novelty, like that's we we want that, and our brains kind of want that and get expanded by that experience. And I mean, I only really started getting affected by electronic music a couple years ago, and I felt that kind of blockage in me, and that that blockage and not being able to kind of move freely on the dance floor. And once I kind of got over that maybe fear, that like ego in me, my whole world has just opened up. You know what I mean? And it's yeah, that's so strange to hear that people don't really search for music after a certain age, because I've only just started, you know what I mean? Like there's so much music out there, you know, and it keeps getting created too. Like I don't know how anyone could ever stop.
I would 100% agree, and I think for many people, the distance they get from uh, I mean, I've heard similar factoids about the way people make friends. They stop making like distinct best friend style friends at a certain point, and there's just a lot of the way that people kind of stop or stay themselves. And I wonder if there's some kind of ideal that like maybe at retirement you can like go back in and like listen to all the things you missed out on, or make new friends or make new partners, or kind of move from a place, because that is part of the a part of the way that our society has sold itself, that like, okay, if you just work really hard and put your nose down and then like someday come up for air.
Mm, mm.
But I just wonder if that isn't either isn't studied properly, or just is cast by the wayside because everyone's too busy golfing or some such. I'm not sure what people do when they're done and they're off to sea or something. That's not so much about the music thing. I do think arts education has also kind of been assailed quite a bit in our education. So I wonder if it is more of an American phenomenon than a worldwide phenomenon as well, in terms of the way this has been studied. Because I
Mm.
go elsewhere, and for instance, in Japan, I'm a big fan of the music cafes that I've witnessed there, and this idea of like sitting down with strangers and listening on beautiful speakers to music that maybe is foreign to, or even just like outside of your normal experience, great classical music, great jazz that you just don't see on the radio or hear synced in film. And that idea that you would pay a little bit and you would just enjoy yourself for hours just doing that very simple, very human act of listening with others is,
Mm.
it's incredible. And the fact that we don't have listening cafes in the States speaks kind of volumes right there.
Right, right, right. Yeah, I feel like, especially nowadays, we lead very insular lives. Did I say insular? um, something.
It works.
Yeah. Right, right. And kind of on this topic of, novelty and wonderment. Um, so it seems like one of your goals as a musician and artist is to provide that experience for others. And we kind of touched upon this, and it might be an unnecessary question to ask, but why do you think that's important? Is it because we don't always get to experience it in our everyday lives, especially now that we're, stuck at home, like everyone's saying, and, quarantining, and we're kind of addicted to technology and other things? Yeah, why do you think that's important?
I mean, I can't speak to the total, but I can speak from a selfish place. As a musician, I want to be heard and I want to be understood. And I it isn't just about being the most efficient form of communication that I know of. There is nothing in my experience that touches the power of resonance with others,
Mm,
and being in the same, not just sound but loud sound, having our bones shook by bass and having our ears kind of chopped off by treble,
mm,
and just generally communicating faster and in greater detail than any other kind of entertainment, or what would be like maybe reduced as entertainment, but really is like this great form of communication, this transcendent form of communication. And so selfishly, I want to live there. I want to just like be there all the time. I want to have those moments. I think societally it's good to know that the humanity around you, and to kind of feel akin to the birds and the beasts, is like, just to go back to Bacon once again,
mm, mm,
kind of give this kind of overall sense of life is resounding. And all life has strangely has ears, and does things like blush, and like all these things that just like, why would all these different disparate creatures have the same thing happening? And it's just, maybe it's just an evolutionary quirk, but I think it's just really the kind of most basic part of our experience in some fashion. And so yeah, I
mm.
just want that both for others, but also by proxy myself, because it's a shared experience for sure.
that's so beautiful, and it's also, if you think about it, it's in our history too, and kind of, I mean, early humans, did it and gathered and played drums, and there's still some societies and places out there where people really do that and gather and hear music and feel that beat and that pulse together, and it's kind of an evolutionary thing. It's built and it's wired in our blood and our DNA, and I feel that kind of community that you were talking about when I'm on the dance floor, and that's why it's so beautiful. It's not just a party and a time to do that, but it's a time to come together and feel that common, I don't know, aliveness or
The,
or
like
that
a through
flow.
thread, yeah, it really is. And that entrainment that we ascribe as being a very human thing is indeed such a powerful spell that's cast. And I will say too that almost every music form that comes into ascendancy, that becomes really popularized, starts in dance.
Mm-hmm.
It's a communication between the music and the dance. If you look at almost all classical music, there's these weird French or Italian notes that are written on your sonatas or your pages that like actually describe dance moves,
Yeah.
and we're just really far away from it. We just think about it as being a BPM, but if
Right.
you really know the dances, actually they lilt and they bounce and they move differently depending on the dance, and you were supposed to kind of play to that. And of course, a musician who was worth their salt back in the day would know all the different dances and know how to play to them.
Yeah.
And then equally with jazz, the valse hot, right? Like it was all about these dance moves.
Mm-hmm.
And as time goes on and the ossification of the people who listen to it, and they kind of become more sedentary or whatever, and they stop moving, and then the music form dies and it becomes academic and it becomes something we study and admire, but it doesn't live the same way with young people who want to move, let's say. And so one of the things I love about electronic music is that you have this form of it that was very academic or very like enshrined in the academy and taught, and maybe propulsed by a different word, soft power of governments and all this stuff. We could talk about that too, but
Mm.
neither here nor there. But then the kind of way that there's going to be people who transgress and start to move to it again, and maybe get snared at by the establishment. But that's why there's a few years ago more so than now, but like EDM was the ugly stepchild of music, of electronic music, but at the same time was like where hundreds of thousands of people would gather, and there was like just nothing more powerful than that. And so it was it was really the commercial leader of the world for that moment, because people wanted to be part of that dance. And of course it battles with being resat, and then some new music form will come along and kind of get it moving again.
Mm.
But yeah, we're in danger, of course, of always, like, as soon as you start teaching this stuff in school, that just people stopping moving, and that's a warning sign for sure.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, we talk about this all the time in different classes, and how, even with opera, you used to go to the opera back when it was kind of a popular form of music, and people would be screaming and
Yeah.
yelling and throwing things the entire time. And now you go, and it's this pseudo, like, sacred space, but nobody feels like they can move. You're stuck in a seat and you clap sometimes, but it feels like such a stilted experience. And I think maybe I'm lucky because I get to be creating that music, so I physically have to move to be creating it, and my body is involved in that experience. Um, but yeah, sometimes it makes me sad that we're so far removed from that, you know,
Well,
that
can I
experience where dance and music are really intertwined.
Well, and can I offer too? Then there's this important, and this kind of goes back to the psychological or the physiological. There's this part of our brain. It's increasingly been proven, even though it seemed like it was a little bit strange for a while. But these mirror neurons exist in all of us, where we basically see someone up on a stage and we identify with the person doing as us. We give the antagonist our own capabilities, our own possibilities. And so to see someone, if you think about back in the day, even though there was great performers and people of note, generally they were non-professionals. Everybody doing music was not a professional. There were just some people who were better than others. There was kind of these touring orchestras, but they weren't so much about like a professional class of people who only did music from their start, and kind of were these names unto themselves. It was about these composer, these kind of freaks of nature who had great big ears that could do that stuff. But the idea that normal people would be doing it, and so the audience would have to be enacted because maybe it was a little out of tune, or maybe they did miss some notes, or maybe it was like a high school musical rather than some sort of professional opera. And so now that you being a professional, you're the stand-in. Like you being so precise and so exuberant and all the different ways that we can express music becomes this kind of normal person who's never had a bit of musical training in their life. They recognize by your talent the expanse and possibility of humanity, and also themselves by proxy, like by attendance. So it is a different act of dancing, right? Just like when you see a ballet, you know, those people in the audience don't necessarily, not at all to a T, or have been former dancers, but they all get the act in them by the doing. And so maybe the same way with you.
Wow. Yeah, the audience is like actually a reflection of what you are. um,
You give them the opportunity. The height of your performance isn't so much the way you meet all the notes; it's the way you catch the audience, right?
exactly. Exactly. Right. And kind of on this note too, I wanted to ask you. This is just something I think about as a person a lot, and as an artist. I think a lot about people that don't experience the world in the same way that normal people do. So either people that are deaf or blind or have physical disabilities. And I actually um, there's a music video that was made by Jamie XX, who's one of my favorite producers and DJs, and it was a video to his song Sleep Sound. And the video, he used children and people from a deaf group in Manchester, and it was watching this was one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen, because through electronic music, these people that don't get to hear normal frequencies or sounds felt the sounds in their bodies, and they looked so happy and so exuberant. And that was one of the most important moments, I think, for me. I'm not sure how to access that through opera or classical music, but I think electronic music is such a great avenue for people to experience sound in ways that they can.
I mean, I'll just offer that opera is actually really amazing how many people attend who don't know the words,
Yeah.
right? You have this very lyrical sung act, and people will go, and I know there's teleprompters and these other things that are possible, but they're experiencing like a lot of word, a lot of lingo, and they're getting the meaning and messaging through your body language, through the dance in part, or the kind of choreography, let's say, and the music itself is transmitting all this. So listening is not a hearing act, is one of the truths, right? We don't, this, it's, we know we listen with our entire body, we listen with our eyes, we listen with all these other sensory apparatus, and ears just do some part of it, maybe the heavier lifting or some other thing, but it's just not that.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, just to go into this thing like neurodivergence and just kind of the kind of ableism that music has constantly been superseding for millennia, in the sense that different groups will be kind of put into proximity with this kind of very basic form of communication, and kind of empathetic observation. You know, music needs this kind of empathy to be transmitted, and like what's an incredible teaching tool of being able to understand like these large lessons and kind of reaching across culture and all this stuff. It's incredible. And just to kind of go back to this idea of like everybody listens different, like nobody listens better or worse. There's really different ideas of pitch. There's perfect pitch, but you can talk to a perfectly pitched person about how much the telephone ringing or the sirens outside drive them up walls, and their perfect pitch is perfect for some situations and some music, and really not suited to other parts of. And so in some ways, as much as we can esteem these people who have A440 firmly fixed, if we were to move to other pitch degrees, they would be they wouldn't be so suited, right? And it's like, is this a quote unquote disability, or is this an ability? And how do we want to caution ourselves from even from kind of having those terminations in our mind, when everybody's really just a different apparatus? We all have our weird omissions of frequencies, we all have our abilities of being able to get to certain degrees, and some of my favorite songs don't exceed an octave, and other things take 5 or 6 to happen. And electronic music is really interesting by the fact that it doesn't always need it doesn't usually ask permission, which I like, but then also it doesn't necessarily need ability. You have a DJ who, first time ever, they're sitting down with a piece of software that does a lot of the work for them, and they're able to beat match something together. Is that less valid than someone who does use vinyl and beat match in these very specific ways, or somebody who's using these complicated, expensive modular systems versus the person who has the freemium software that just does the thing for them? and it's usually about outcomes more than the procedure, but not always. Just sometimes it's kind of interesting.
Mm, mm. Wow. Yeah, that was a great reminder for me actually. Everybody everybody is different and experiences the world in a different way. Um, yeah. Yeah, and also yeah, going back to the idea of opera and the voice, and also I mean, yeah, most of the the performances for me that I've experienced that were the most powerful from another singer have been the ones where I didn't really know what they were saying, and just the pure just hearing their sound and whatever colors and emotions were in that sound just pierced me in some way, even though I didn't know what they were saying. Yeah, yeah, it's music is communication with or without words, but normally kind of without. So it's a way to communicate what we can't put into words, obviously.
And I love the fact that a lot of opera fans are willing to sit through that, willing to do that work versus a lot of other music bodies. They don't necessarily get outside of their, be it because of a title or the person conveying it, or just the kind of like allegiances and weird national pride that people stay in their own kind of ear spaces. But yeah, it's I, I'm excited the world is becoming more international. The ascendancy of K-pop means that we all are learning at some level some Korean, but also just like getting different ideas of fed back to us through a refraction of the U.S. pop industry and other worldwide industries, but with its own very singular flair. It's
Mm,
it's just going to
yeah.
get more. It's not just BTS or whatever.
Right.
Blackpink. There's a lot of other elsewheres waiting in the wings.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and kind of switching gears actually back to something that you brought up before, the religiosity of music. I find this parallel between classical music and opera and then electronic music, and they both kind of ascend or transcend to like a higher power for me in different ways, but I think maybe just speaks to that all music can be a spiritual or religious experience. And yeah, do you think about that when you're performing, or do you feel that, or
100%. I really do feel like the musician, knowing or unknowingly, is playing in like primordial forces that go to the middle of us, go to like this very center of our existence, and oftentimes we kind of dabble in that on like we kind of stomp around, like pushing buttons and pulling levers that elicit emotions and can have deep effect. It's like that's the name of our game, is like, well, how many minor chords can we string in a row, and how can we make this sadder, and how can we make this happier, and
mm-hmm.
and kind of, or push people into the dance, or these things. And it's like, this is deep psychological, religious, whatever, like whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to ascribe to.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we're really wantonly doing that. So it has this kind of feeling sometimes of like, as we're stumbling around, like learning those effects, we're not giving it so much time to like sink in for ourselves. It's like someone who does body work or massage, how they
Mm-hmm.
often have to like receive massage themselves to undo like the the kind of damage they're like bringing on from the person they're massaging, like, so to speak. There's like a,
Yeah.
and like, I don't know how much, at least my producer friends, they don't usually stop to think about what they're doing, or to like, you know do some good therapy to like talk about the kind of, not just the very human toll that it takes, but just the kind of things that they're confronted with when you're in those kind of heavy spaces.
Right.
And so to me, it's like we're walking on sacred ground when we take a stage, and we're playing in forces that you can't ever be totally conscious of, but just simply kind of being respectful towards can go a long way in my experience.
Mm.
So I definitely try to express that to the students, but we're also busy trying to catch up with the commodification that requires us to be quick and prolific and kind of mindless about how much we're feeding and like doling out of this thing.
Mm.
So it's yeah, I'm constantly striving to be better at that aspect of being respectful and being mindful of the effect. But
Right. Yeah, respect and awareness, I guess. Awareness is key as long as you're aware. Yeah. Yeah.
Or at least, and also, and then in some real physical way, like I've been getting more into this idea of music therapy, or the kind of uh, some of the different cultural ideas of music as healing. Not just because it's just interesting sound phenomena and I'm just like down for all that kind of stuff, but also I think it's really important to see the kind of conclusions that others have gotten to, that although they may seem kind of ridiculous at the time, that a certain frequency can speak to a certain organ, or a certain frequency correlates to a some sort of celestial body, and that somehow can play a role in our own manifest. Like, great, like, I'm fully on board with everybody's particulars. I'm not quite eating only blonde or white foods like Eric Satie, but like I'm willing to try for a couple days. Like, if it helps me sound like Eric Satie, let's do this. But anyways, the idea though of kind of communicating with these different respectful traditions to try to understand how those resonances may play a role in music to come, I think is actually valid. I'm not saying we should all start going to eighth 434 or 432. 434, I think it is like this magical, one of these tonal centers that's like supposed to undo bad energy or something. Like, okay, what, like, sure, but also, like,
Yeah.
why not do the thought exercise and really try to explore a little bit more of what is kind of the intentionality in sound, because we're certainly picking notes. Why not pick like whole systems to also be our melodies, be our harmonies?
Mm. Wow. Right, and this is more, it's not a surface level question, but I just really want to ask you who are some of your favorite artists and musicians and producers that you like to listen to, or who have given you a kind of powerful experience?
Yeah, there's there's a lot, and I I don't even feel like I try to go out of my way to meet these musicians or to like encounter their music. I just feel like every once in a while I'll hear something. It's like, oh, that's going to be me for the next 6 months, year, for the rest of my life. I'm just going to be diving into their catalogs, and like some of it has happened by happenstance and changed my life, and other things I've really gone out of my way to, like, I want to hear something new today and change my life. And
Mm-hmm.
then other things are by recommendation or a peer who, through kind of mutual respect, I've been able to like sit with their music more. So just a few things. Like, one of them, the very first one that I would usually point at, is this artist named Acen, Acen.
Mm-hmm.
They uh, British electronic producer of the kind of rave ilk. They were making music in like 91, 92, and very plunderphonic. They were the one that impressed upon me the possibility of mending jazz and classical music with breakbeats and kind of dance music in a way that felt not kind of cheesy, just like adding a bunch of like hi-hat to a Christmas song doesn't quite do it for me.
Yeah.
But this idea of like real, so they were sampling things like John Barry, and John Barry, who did a lot of the music for the James Bond films in like the 60s and 70s, as such a non sequitur with like the kind of funk and soul music of the 80s and 70s, and putting these elements together to make like a really visceral music that called out to me. So Asen was like, I didn't know how they were doing it at the time, but it's like, oh, this is the universe. And in a time where music was a little bit more scarce, you couldn't just Shazam something and figure out who it was. There was a lot of mystery involved, and I
Mm.
started to collect those sounds and to kind of listen to what the composers were listening to and sampling from and creating, not having the technology, but just starting to like go back through, do some time traveling through their ears was great, really useful to me. And then a little later, there was an artist named Ray Keith who was dabbling in jungle and drum and bass,
Mm-hmm.
and that became like an obsession and an excursion into those kind of tempos, like faster tempos, more visceral tempos. And and then equally, there was an artist named Thalocyanine who made just like incredibly difficult music, incredibly complicated. I worked for his label for a period of time, and one of my first releases came out on that label. So he not only was like this musical mountain, but also like a place by which I could then start to see myself as an artist, which is one of the best gifts that any kind of musician can give you, is the ability, of course, to like see yourself in a different light. or see yourself as valid. From invalid to valid is a
Mm.
pretty big transformation.
Right.
um, More fast forward a lot of time, there's artists that I really esteem, like Lorraine James is a new voice, and they are just making tremulously difficult, experimental, beautiful, and they happen to actually be working with a fellow Los Angelino named Baths, who I've also worked with on records. Um, Baths, he appears on Lorraine's new record. Um, yeah, I could kind of just keep going if you want me to, but the main thing is that I'm constantly assailed by the fact that I just there's never enough time to hear it all. Um, and also, if you're really willing to dive, you may encounter a single song or an artist or a movement that's interesting, but oftentimes they tend to form better when they're unseen and not brought to some popular light. Like I'm a really big fan right now of Jersey club music, and not just what's like happening on the kind of surface of that. Like there's some songs that have kind of gone TikTok viral. It's great, but equally, some of the producers who are making just like really fringy stuff that only exists on like a SoundCloud. And you can tell it's kind of fringy because they only have like a couple hundred followers, and there's like no other releases, and yet some of the most visceral happening music.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
And it's just like, wow, well, how can I get more of this? And it's like I can't, because I'm not there, and I'm not part, I'm out of the group, and that's okay. Like I understand that it's not going to be for me in total forever, but as a fan of music, I love that the culture can be happening and can be danced to, and can be, in their small circle, they can be very famous and very happening and very all those things. And
Mm.
I can just cheer them on a bit as best I can.
Wow.
No.
That's so funny. I did not expect you to talk about Jersey Club. I love that
Some
so
great
much.
good stuff going on.
That's awesome. Yeah, yeah. Um, and kind of on that note too, I've listened to not your entire discography, but a lot of it, and I'm just really interested to know what's either your favorite record that you've ever made, or like some of them, or a period of time. If you can answer that for me.
I mean, I think you'll find if I really do encourage you to go on to interview more artists, and to get the answers that you want, and then maybe by proxy your audience is interested in.
Mhm.
I do think this is one of those questions that can be difficult, not only because artists don't tend to know how to, there's different periods in our lives, and there's different kinds of ways that things can be important or can be favorite.
Yeah.
Usually the my patent answer, because it is a question that gets asked sometimes, is
Oh.
like the record that's not yet. No, it's all good. It's great in some ways, because we can always look afresh at like why we're having these feelings and what are
Mhm.
the responses that come up,
Mhm.
for ourselves, or maybe for you, maybe as you continue to go on and ask this more. But I'm
Mhm.
always like, the record that's coming is the best record that I've ever done.
Yeah.
It's the work that's yet to be and isn't manifested and hasn't been touched by a lot of different hands or ears, and it
Mhm.
doesn't have to necessarily be apprehended by history. I have certain records where I'm a fan of the record, but somebody passed away. This has happened on two occasions now, where
Mm.
somebody passed away that was on the record before the record came out. And it's like, I don't know how I feel about this now. I don't know how
Yeah.
this what this record means or does in the light of these kind of passings, um, and how I want to release or kind of enjoy that music in that kind of light.
Mhm.
Then there's also the answer of like, well, some records are more important, for a cultural consciousness or a zeitgeist. Or I have my first record, well, what I call my first record, Invention, has this been sampled by this artist Madlib for this Mad Villain record,
Right. Right.
and that makes it. Although I have records that have sold more, or records that have done commercial things, but I think this makes it the most important for the kind of continuing culture as this record continues to be resampled and changed and amended, and the
Mhm.
kind of way that the song Accordion has gone on to have like a lot of different lives
Yeah.
is wondrous. And I'm still like, I love the fact that I can participate even at arm's length or greater
Mhm.
with that translation of that song elsewhere, um, as it becomes, like the children of people like Madlib and MF Doom going on to be, listening and hearing and feeling it. And then from a commercial standpoint, like I did a record called Labyrinths that has a song called Special Request, and Special Request is like my most played song on Spotify or whatever, and
Right.
probably has generated like not necessarily the most money. That's probably from things that have been synced, but have just, those kind of raw amount of ears listening to something is just, it boggles my mind that, some 2 million or whatever on Spotify alone, much less the other services, have kind of encountered that song. And that song is fine. It's a fine song and I like it very much, but it's also just like, is it the best song? Is it the most important song?
Mm.
Is it that thing?
Mm-hmm.
So there's all these different versions of an answer. Um,
Right.
yeah, I do like the Misfit Children a lot. I like the records that haven't necessarily, that for whatever reason just don't get heard too often. The ones that are kind of divier. Like, did you ever in your listening and your encountering, did you ever come across a record called Agent?
Um, I don't.
Agent.
I don't think so. No.
You're right. It was on a Japanese German label. It
Okay.
came out in like 2004 or something. It's like ages old, and to me, it was one of the records I labored the longest on because I really tried to weave in this huge narrative into it, and
Okay.
also in hindsight too, like I'm on this cover of this record and I'm dressed up in this like silly kind of animated outfit, and even the title Agent, and in hindsight it's become really important to me because it's the first record where I knew I wasn't what I was presenting to be at some level. I
Mm.
knew I was a double agent for my gender in hindsight. I didn't realize at the time that I was a I was not going to, I was non-binary at the time. I didn't realize that, but over years of introspection, kind of coming to this conclusion of being non-binary, it's like, oh, I knew that back when I did this record this many years ago. Like this record tattletaled on me in this huge way,
Yeah.
and I wasn't listening to myself like I should have been. I wasn't listening to the message that the music was knowing better than I could, and I love that the record kind of have that power and figure that out. And I'm just along for the ride sometimes, right?
Wow.
So that record has become important to me. But again, like that's just me. That's not like that isn't the most important record by any measure. It's barely been heard, but at the same time, I
Mm-hmm.
like that it exists as this like affront to myself
Mm.
or my notion of self at the time. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the idea of self is so pivotal for everyone, but especially the artist or musician, or the idea of having an identity or building one, or something that's marketable or not.
Mhm.
Or I think about that a lot as I'm trying to make this career for myself, and sometimes I don't want to be bothered with having to market myself. I just want to be accepted for who I am, but I think that can be tricky too, navigating that, and maybe sometimes feeling, I don't know, torn between maybe who you are and the way other people will perceive you, or I don't know.
I think in electronic music has looked at this very uniquely. We don't you don't tend to have bands in electronic music, right? There tends to be individuals,
Yeah.
and as individuals, you do see, especially when you're dating back to the kind of more academic electronic music or the music concrete or these other things, that they're just the names of the person, and they're making outsized music that has significance, but they're doing it from a place where they're still at arm's length because they're not performers. Tend to be, right? They're not getting on a stage doing something that transforms the musical listening experience. They tend to just recapitulate existing pieces or try to get exactly things back. And then
Right.
if you advance forward a bit into the more popular age where these performers were the producer and the maker, and going beyond the Laurie Andersons and some otherwise, of the 80s, and we're really getting into the 90s where everyone had an alias, everyone had assumed identity. And that's partially because the music started to get grander and louder and brighter than any one individual could kind of hold.
Mm.
And it became more about this kind of self-branding or this kind of more of a notional sense of self and sound than the kind of the delineation of just what a name would be. Just the simple name is kind of reductive versus some concept.
Mm.
And I bring them up not just because they're a friend, but also because they're a transformational figure for our scene. But like Flying Lotus,
Yeah.
it's their name is not Flying Lotus in life. It's kind of an ambiguous term. It doesn't necessarily have any like preceding idea in our culture of what a Flying Lotus would be. It's not tied to one thing or another, and yet it has enough span to it that it fits a lot of different notions, and it comes to represent the music that they're going to do, and open up an idea of form that somebody might pick up a record without any knowledge and have some concept, and
Mm.
how powerful that, and you could say that's branding, but in many other ways it's just the freedom from like the really defined reductive sense of a body that is just 10 fingers or less or more, or
Mm.
10 toes or less or more, or 2 ears or less or more,
Yeah.
and allows for something else to be in the room. So electronic music that has a great history of that. Now, of course, we have bands with names, but you still tend to know the name of the person in the band, and they don't get the chance to transform the same way necessarily, unless you're like a David Bowie, who you
Mm,
never knew the names of his band members. Generally, you just knew David Bowie
right.
and the kind of various monikers that he would pick up. And there's people who have done it before electronic music did, but I do feel like electronic music, with its ambiguity and its kind of lack of humanity at times, it's reaching for something maybe bigger,
Mm.
and that these aliases can help with that. And maybe you yourself, if by picking an alias, maybe the stage becomes a little easier to have your have your point of view on, and allow you to not have to do the branding exercise, even though it itself, the naming, is a branding exercise, right? Like
Right.
it's
Yeah.
kind of a tough one, but
It's paradoxical there. Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow. I mean, this has been so amazing. We touched upon a lot of really great things. I mean, electronic music as transformational, as spiritual, religious, as communication, as everything basically. And I think that's what your music really does for me. It just reminds me that I don't even know. I can't even put it into words, but every time I listen to it, I feel yeah, alive and grateful that I can hear your music and everything. And it really means so much that you sat down with me and spoke with me about these things that were, some of it was difficult and important. But yeah, it really means so much. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely, Sarah. Thank you so much for the chance. I really do appreciate it. And yeah, and equally good. I really do hope you continue these conversations with those you esteem and people who maybe catch you off guard, and however else you find yourself. Because I mean, I'm looking forward to hearing your music as well, and kind of hearing the things you're kind of concocting and coming up with, and
Mhm.
just I hope you get to some really concrete answers that you could then reflect upon for the rest of us, because we all could use some help figuring out this whole music thing, much less this life thing. It'd be great. Please, if you don't mind doing that in your free time, I would appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you.